funny thing is that I already, as a child, I was doing research, and when I was about 12 years old, I started to visit the archives in the National Library, the Royal Library, and the archivists and the librarians, they treated me as a grown-up a researcher. And a very important source of inspiration was my mother. My mother has never gone to school. She was trained by her mother, who was a former school teacher. But she inspired me to visit the archives, to dig into the history of our family and to the local community and so on. So I was sort of a researcher from the very beginning. The reason why I went to Paris in '79 was that I thought that the Annales School was some of the most inspiring way of doing historical research. As a trained historian and ethnologist, I liked the notion of histoire totale, and I wrote to Professor Ladoury and asked him if he would supervise me on my project on the history of the very local community I moved to as 14 years old. It was this boring community in the middle of Buckland with no with no interesting and fancy history. I wanted to make an histoire totale about this community, and Ladoury, he liked that idea. The French scholar Henri Lefebvre is very important for me, but his sort of historical work and his analytical work, I couldn't have done all this without his approach. His theoretical work and empirical work is sort of very important for me. The way he sort of combined a structural analysis with historical process analysis, that's done really in a way I try to follow. And my professor in Paris, Emmanuel Ladoury, has also been important for me in the way he sort of is not afraid of trying to make a broader analysis and claim a larger perspective on things, on history. I followed classes at l'école des hautes études en sciences sociales on Boulevard Raspail. But I also went to Collège de France, where Latoury had his lectures, and I went to Vincennes, to a very radical university. But Nanterre, where I had two teachers. One was very oriented towards the American sociology, and the other was oriented very much Marxist sociology towards British sociology. And both, or they had this class together. And that made this class very special because it was open for discussion. But nothing could be said that this is the truth. All could be questioned and discussed. And I think that this philosophy of keeping discussing, putting questions to problems had been very important for me to learn, and that students could also come up with qualified questions. You were taken seriously and considered as sort of equal with your professors. And I think that helped me a lot to learn how to teach, and that was sort of, I later tried to talk or tried to train my own students in questioning what is a document, and not sort of be sure that you have the answer, but more interested in thinking, oh wow, that could also be a possible answer.
Well, my name is Michael Buckland, and I'm sitting here in South Hall, the building of the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley, formerly the School of Librarianship. And I was born and educated in England. In my secondary school and university, I studied primarily history and some French. After I finished at university, I did not know what I wanted to do, so I decided that provisionally, temporarily, I would work in libraries. I thought that libraries were socially beneficial institutions, and I imagined that working in a library would be congenial. So I spent a year at the Bodleian Library, the Library of Oxford University, doing cataloguing. And then I was one of the first group of students at the new School of Librarianship and Information Science at the University of Sheffield. And after that, I went to work as a librarian at the new University of Lancaster in the northwest of England. The university had been teaching only for 1 year, and it was a wonderful experience to be part of a small group of library staff creating a university library. It was a good experience because I did a little bit of almost everything that is done in a library. But after a year and a half, I had a new assignment. I worked for 5 years full-time, doing a series of studies of how library services might be improved, with an emphasis on measurement and quantitative models for planning. And this gave me a lot of interest in a sort of systems approach. How are the parts related to each other? After that, I moved to the United States, where I worked at Purdue University Libraries, a large, complex library in a large university not too far from Chicago. And then I came to the School of Librarianship at the University of California, Berkeley, where they had decided that changes were needed. The idea was that a school of librarianship, training librarians to work in libraries, was a very good thing, but there were enormous and increasing problems dealing with documents and data outside of libraries, corporate archives, databases, and all kinds of marking and parking of documents and data for folks to use in many different contexts. And this was not receiving attention, and people were not being trained. So the idea was that it would be a good idea if the Berkeley School of Librarianship was to diversify its interests. It would be a good challenge, both for research and for theory and for education, to provide professional education and investigation of these contexts outside of libraries that had to do with documents. And so I came to Berkeley to help make that happen. After a number of years, I stopped doing that, and I was a bureaucrat responsible for coordination in library matters for the 100 libraries of the 9 campuses of the University of California. And after that, I went back to the school, which had changed its names, first to School of Library and Information Studies, and then to School of Information Management and Systems. It's now the School of Information. So I went back to the school as just a professor, and I did some teaching of library services and cataloguing. But I remained interested in how the parts fitted together. It seemed to me that although a major strategic change had been made in the scope and the direction of the school, it seemed to me that although a major change had been made in the scope and direction of the school, and although everybody thought this was a good idea, and it seemed to be a success, there had been very little theory, very little thinking about the rationale behind this. So I decided to think about it and to try to write about it. And the first part of this was about library services. How do the different parts of library service connect to each other, and how do they relate to the environment? The economic, political, social, cultural environment of the library. This was published as a book called Library Services in Theory and Context. But that was only a preliminary study. The real goal was to look at this range of information services and systems outside of libraries as well as inside the library. I thought of this in terms of comparative anatomy. If you take all the different kinds of services that provide information and are based on collections, how would you arrange them? Where would you find the similarities and where the differences? Just as in comparative anatomy, you might get different mammals and you look at which ones are related to each other. Now, in this broader attempt, I wanted to include museums, and by including museums, I didn't mean the museum's records, I meant the museum's objects. I wanted to include museums as a collection of informative things, but in the 1980s, I would say that the concepts and terminology of information science were not hospitable to the idea of museum objects as information. And I didn't know how to do that, and I felt that a book or a treatment would be incomplete without it. so very early in 1988, I happened to go to the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology on the campus that had an open house. And in it, I saw skeletons and other objects, but what really interested me was a beautiful cabinet containing dead birds, specimens of dead birds. And I thought, this is ridiculous. At the Berkeley campus, there is a great shortage of space. It's not rational to use space in the middle of the campus for a collection of dead birds. But then I thought, maybe there is a rationale. What could it be? It's a university, and the university is responsible for teaching and for research. So these are presumably resources used for learning, for teaching, for research. And then as a librarian, it became clear these dead birds function like the books on the shelves in the library. So you could call this collection a library of dead birds, or you could say these birds are functioning as documents. They're not printed documents, they're not on paper, but they have that function. So I was very excited by this, because this idea would enable me to finish my book, and it did. And so I would talk to everybody about dead birds as documents. I then went to Australia, to the University of New South Wales, and I explained my new idea to Boyd Raywood, who was the head of the library school there, and he said, "Stop, it's not a new idea, look at this document." So I read it, and it was my idea, but it was written in French nearly 40 years before by a French librarian called Suzanne Brillet, and her example was an antelope in a zoo, not dead birds in a museum, but it was clearly the same kind of thing. So that's how I got to know about Suzanne Brillet and her antelope, and I finished the book. It was called Information and Information Systems, and I used the example of the antelope, not the dead birds, because she thought of it first. I also wrote an article about including dead birds, no, not dead birds, antelopes, and other things as a kind of information. The article was called Information as Thing, and a lot of people read it, and a lot of people have cited it.
It was through the meeting in '96 with Michael Buckland and Boyd Raywood in Copenhagen at the Cooley's conference, and the article on what is a document by Michael, which told me that Suzanne Brillet was an important person. Yeah. I know more about the French documentalists through the work of French historians. My connection to the Annales school.
Now, in 1996, I was invited to keynote a conference. It was the second conference on conceptions of library and information science, and I decided to talk about a broad concept of what a school of information could be. And could you have a school of information studies that was not a professional school? It was about what Americans call liberal arts, which means studying things that are interesting, and you study them because they're interesting, not because studying them would be useful. And I talked about this, and I also mentioned my document approach, emphasizing documents rather than the notion of information. And in the audience at the back was Niels Lund, And when he heard this, he was very pleased because it was similar to his ideas. And he thought that he was the only person to have these ideas, so he was pleased to find that I did too. Boyd Raywood was also there, so the three of us decided that we would form the neo-documentalist movement.
In 1999, I went to San Francisco and to Palo Alto to visit the research group in experimental documents, or at Palo Alto Research Center, where they worked on an exhibition on a different kind of devices for reading. And there I met Marbeth, who is a sound designer, and this a way of this form of research documents in an experimental way was very inspiring for me. I also met Michael Buckland and taught about a different kind of documents, and both the connection to Marbeth in Palo Alto and the connection to Michael Buckland in 1999 led to my decision to go in spring 2001 to stay at Berkeley, to be a visiting professor there, and to live in San Francisco, and in addition to Marbeth and Michael Buckland, I also had a connection to J. David Boulder at Georgia Tech. He has written a very good book on the documents. I'll say it is called Writing Space. And I also went to Atlanta to visit him, and we had a vision on making a kind of distributed environment for students to work on different kinds of documents, and so somehow it was the document approach from Michael, the experimental approach from Marbeth, and the media approach from Jay, who sort of all three were mixed into this idea of making a document academy, which actually also was the name of our homemade a website for our students in Tromsø. So we tried at that time to make a kind of online community for all this. We didn't succeed in getting funding, and the website was closed by the administration at our university because they wouldn't allow us to make homepages. But nevertheless, when Marbeth and I sat at Muddy Waters Cafe in Mission in San Francisco, we decided that we would create this document academy, and we called it academy in order to have the ambitions of doing the very best, and we didn't choose the notion of studio because studio would be too much artistic, and center would be too much sort of having a center someplace. So that's how we made it, and we had the very important ambition of bringing theorists and practitioners, both artists and researchers and engineers, together from all over.
In one of his, probably in his first visit, Niels and I and a student called Alan Conrad had lunch in the faculty club. And it was a very interesting discussion. For example, Niels gave a list of the different groups and institutions and the way they use documents to influence society. An obvious example is that schools use textbooks to guide the students' learning, and also, it should be said, to control the teachers as to what they teach. And of course, religions use holy books to persuade the members of that religion to behave in a certain way and to believe certain things. And the government uses passports and income tax returns and many other ways to influence our life. People often speak of the information society, but that's wrong. It's the big change from prehistoric times has been the rise of documents. We've become more and more a document society. And early on, while he was in a cafe in San Francisco, Muddy's Coffee House, he and a friend decided that they would form an organization known as the Document Academy. It was an informal, collaborative venture. It was his idea, or his and Mary Beth back. And so I helped him do that, and we organized a conference here in South Hall, in which we invited a number of people. Most of the arranging and the selection of speakers was done by Niels, but I was able to help with the organization and the room and the food, and it was a successful conference. And nearly 20 years later, it continues. He decided that there should be a conference, a meeting. And so there were some practical problems with this. The Document Academy was never formally, legally organized. It was always an informal, cooperative, collaborative. But here at Berkeley, we got permission to use the South Hall, the rooms in South Hall. It's now called the School of Information. It had originally been the School of Librarianship, and at that time it was called the School of Information Management and Systems, but it's all the same school. So we were allowed to use the rooms, including the one I'm sitting in now. We tried to make it as economical as possible. As I recall, we charged an attendance fee, a registration fee of $25. This included a banquet. And we did the banquet by going, Niels and Roswitha and I and others, we went to a big store where you can buy large amounts of food inexpensively. And we brought it back. And it was vegetarian, except that Niels insisted there should be some salmon. The meeting was a great success, I thought, and the keynote speaker was Roger Pedoc, except Roger Pedoc doesn't really exist any more than the Document Academy really exists legally, and it was Jean-Michel Salouin who came. But it was a good meeting, and we repeated it over the next years.
It was a different way of having conference. They were surprised by the room for discussion, that we sort of really wanted discussions. We were not so obsessed by doing presentations. We were more into talking about things. And we also had a discussion on whether to limit it to the LIS, to library field, or to broaden it. And the broad approach was chosen, although I can see that we have not been able to go much beyond. It is still primarily a LIS conference, but that's okay. And we had a very nice event at Michael's home and on his terrace, where we decided that any future DOCAM should take place at Berkeley. Well, that it didn't work that way. After some years, we could, and after retirement of Michael, we couldn't keep it at South Hall, but it was a very good start. And anybody would like to go to Berkeley, of course.
My first meeting with Jeanette, and I used him to present my ideas on the first DOCAM. And I remember it as a very nice meeting. It was very not too many people, but very nice discussions and a very nice atmosphere for discussing and talking to other people. And we were a small group, and I remember that Michael invited us home to his house, and we had dinner there. Special with this conference because it's a very including conference. It's not that we have, I think almost every idea can be presented, and you do not need to be a senior scholar or something. We also welcome master students or PhD students, and we very much welcome work in progress to be presented. And also what I heard from other participants is that they enjoy very much to meet people from different disciplines, and that you are not, it's not like you are inside or you are outside, and if you are outside your discipline you are not allowed to talk about it. So I think this is a great advantage of DOCAM, even if it's a small group of people, normally each year, and many of us know each other good now, very good, and we have contact also in other connections with research programs or other conferences. I think it's the open-mindedness of the conference.
It was always a small meeting with not very many people, but it was always very friendly, informal, and interesting in a way that not all conferences are. And I think that Niels's emphasis on a document-centric universe, where you start with the concept of a document and then play out its different dimensions, ramifications. Of course, there's the technical and technological changes going on and how they are used and how they are adapted. And then, of course, there's the cognitive or intellectual aspect. And also there's the social and the cultural context in which these things are done. And so his three-dimensional view of the universe, a document-based one, has proved very helpful to me in thinking through these. Not only are these three different dimensions different, but they can't be properly separated from each other. In that sense, they are complementary in that you cannot study one in the absence of the others.